Let's take a trip back in time and learn about the League of Women Voters, both national and the Elkhart County chapter. The League has many goals besides voting rights. Women's rights campaigns started much later in the U.S. than in Europe. Elizabeth Cady Stanton married anti-slavery lawyer Henry Stanton in 1840. They spent their honeymoon at an English abolitionist convention. It was there that Elizabeth met Lucretia Mott, a Quaker abolitionist who was active in the women's rights movement. Mrs. Stanton and Mott were upset when they were not allowed to attend the convention due to their gender. When they returned home, Mott and Stanton spent 8 years writing, meeting, and rallying women's rights advocates in the U.S. Finally, in 1848, Stanton, Mott, Mary Ann McClintock, Martha Coffin Wright, Jane Hunt, and Frederick Douglass held the convention at the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls. The 1848 convention in Seneca Falls, the hometown of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, launched the women's suffrage movement in this country. 300 people attended. Elizabeth Stanton and Frederick Douglass were the main speakers. The convention was about much more than votes for women. Stanton presented her Declaration of Sentiments, rights that she felt all women were entitled to: the right to own property, the right not to be considered property of the husband and not to be subject to marital rape, and the right to not be abused, the right to have legal say about children's upbringing and custody if divorced, the right to have access to jobs and equal pay, the right to keep their own money, open a bank account, the right to purchase without a man's signature, and women could not open a credit card without a cosign until 1975, the right to an education, and finally, the right to vote in elections, an idea not accepted by all. Frederick Douglass's speech justified the right of women and all citizens to vote. So with Stanton and Douglass's support, the right to vote was included on the Declaration of Women's Rights. 3 years later, in 1851, Stanton meets Susan B. Anthony. Because Stanton had a home to run and eventually 7 children, the unmarried Anthony agreed to deliver speeches that Elizabeth wrote. Susan Anthony was able to travel freely around the country to further the cause. She was very persuasive and became very well known, thus becoming the famous one of the duo. When she was at the Stanton home, Anthony would help with the housework and child care so Elizabeth could write the speeches. Their collaboration was very successful. In 1869, they formed the American Equal Rights Association, AERA, with Frederick Douglass. 3 years later, in May of 1869, Congress introduced the 15th Amendment. Douglass argued that the AERA should support the amendment for black men's vote while continuing to fight for women's suffrage. Stanton felt that giving votes to men and ignoring women would put the cause of women's rights years behind. She pointed out how so many educated women were being ignored while even uneducated men could vote. She felt support from black men and immigrants would bring about change needed for women. The AERA dissolved, the 15th Amendment passed, and Anthony and Stanton formed the National Women's Suffrage Association. This group worked at the federal level for equal pay, divorce laws, child welfare laws, and in 1890, the National Women's Suffrage Association merged with the American Women's Suffrage Association, a group that worked at the state level for strictly women's suffrage. The combined group called themselves the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Stanton died in 1902 and Anthony died in 1906. The 19th Amendment was passed in 1920. All groups working on suffrage transferred into the League of Women Voters. In those early years of protest, 2 Beardsley women from Elkhart were advocates of women's rights, including votes for women. Elizabeth Baldwin Beardsley, 1850 to 1924, was married to Albert Beardsley, nephew of the founder of Elkhart, Havila Beardsley. She was known as a flag lady because she donated flags to schools, fire departments, and other city offices and organizations. Elizabeth was on the board of trustees for the library and active in the Women's Franchise League started by Helen Beardsley in 1913.
She was a big supporter of the League. In 1910, she donated her home at 311 West High Street to the League. Elizabeth and Albert moved into the Ruthmere Mansion at that time. They named the famous mansion after their daughter Ruth, who died soon after birth. Helen Beardsley was 23 younger than Elizabeth. She was married to Andrew Hub Beardsley, the nephew of Albert and successor to the Dr. Miles Company, as Elizabeth and Albert had no surviving children. A.H. or Hub Beardsley secured a $35,000 grant from Carnegie for the Elkhart Public Library, which sits at 2nd and High Street. Hub started the instrument companies in Elkhart and made Dr. Miles' lab, Miles Laboratory, and developed many new products. Hub was a state senator. His platform included women's suffrage. Helen Beardsley founded the Elkhart chapter of the Women's Franchise League of Indiana in 1913. She bought a bookmobile for the town of Elkhart, and her and Elizabeth filled it with books. Before the birth of her first child, she was the first woman on the Elkhart School Board. In 1917, Helen went to Washington with a group of 41 other protesters to march with Nellie Barnes of Indianapolis. As were many others, Nellie was arrested and spent time in jail. The protesters would go on hunger strikes in jail, and many of the protesters were force-fed through the mouth or through the nose, and can be very painful. Besides marching, Helen had a meeting set up with President Wilson in 1917, and her group explained to him why giving women the vote would help his party. A majority of the marching women were temperance union members. They also were mothers who would be sending their sons to war. Wilson needed support for the war, which we entered in April 1917. So Wilson supported votes for women, got support for the war, and the women had prohibition and finally support for a women's vote from the president. There was still work to be done: letter writing, marching, and picketing. In 1919, Helen had 100 women in Elkhart for the Women's Franchise League Convention. After the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, the Women's Franchise League became the League of Women Voters. Helen was the first president of the League of Women Voters in 1920 from 1922. The state headquarters were in Elkhart, moving to Indianapolis in 1923. I'd like to mention one of our more committed members of the League of Women Voters, Shirley Gold. She passed away in 2022 and was a president of the League of Women Voters of Elkhart County for over 35 years. During her presidency, the League conducted studies and lobbied local government, which led to the establishment of the Elkhart County Juvenile Detention Center and the first battered women's shelter in Elkhart County. 3 local television stations carried mayoral county commissioner and 2nd congressional debates, and 1 congressional debate was on national C-SPAN. Other debates were always broadcast on the radio. Shirley was given the Sagamore of the Wabash Award from the governor, the keys to the city of Elkhart twice, and in 2001, both the Democratic and Republican parties gave her awards for giving the candidates a chance to attend forums and debates. She received Citizen of the Year in 2001. Shirley was a docent of the Midwest Museum of Art for 25 years. She was on the board of directors for the YMCA and Elkhart General Hospital and was a member of many groups, including the NAACP, for 60 years. Here's a photo of the 75th anniversary of the League of Women Voters of Elkhart preparations. Jane Burns was a vice president, Shirley Gold president, Jody Comer, her daughter, was a treasurer, and Shirley Chaddock was a former president. They were going over all the League's accomplishment over the years. One of them was to get out the vote. That was in 1924. They had a 73% turnout. And there were appropriations for maternity and infancy needs, and that was done in Elkhart. And in 1919, there was a Child Welfare Commission, and equal guardianship of children was given, and they worked on getting Elkhart County to enforce those laws. There was also an 8-hour day for women in industry that the League lobbied for. School attendance and child labor laws were also on the agenda for those years. The next slide is Women's Study for a battered women's group. They set out brochures, and they also did a sign up for people and questionnaires. and they were sent out to all the agencies, and it was determined that there was a great need for a shelter. So the Battered Women's Shelter was instituted in Elkhart due to the League of Women Voters. The next one is a mayoral debate in 1983. It includes Carol Fauci, Shirley Gold, and Reva Sherry. The next slide is with the voting signs that the Elkhart business owners supplied. There were multiple billboards to encourage people to vote. These were placed throughout the city, so Shirley was very helpful in getting those done. After Shirley retired, Sharon Schaefer served as president of the League of Women Voters of Elkhart County for many years. She was also active in the American Association of University Women and the Hillcrest United Methodist Church. She was concerned about everyone's voting rights, women's rights, and educational opportunities for women. Sharon was very proud of all the children that she and her husband Mike fostered over the years. Sharon also died in 2022. Our more recent presidents are Janet Evanja from 2019 to 2021, Mike Settles from 2021 to 2023, and Rose Goyette from 2023 to 2024.